The carriage wheels groaned against the muddy path as it made its way through the dense Pennsylvania fog. Inside, Elias Dellinger pressed his forehead against the cold glass, watching as the familiar silhouette of Dellinger Manor emerged from the mist like a spectre rising from its grave. 10 years had passed since he'd last seen his ancestral home. 10 years confined to the stone walls and iron bars of Blackwood Asylum, where his screams about shadowy figures and whispering voices had been silenced with laudanum and cold water treatments. "We've arrived, sir," the driver announced, his voice tinged with unmistakable relief. No one from the nearby town of Millbrook willingly approached the Dellinger property after nightfall. Not since the hanging of 1842. Elias stepped down from the carriage, his boots sinking slightly into the rain-soaked earth. At 32, he was already older than any Dellinger male had lived to be in 6 generations. The asylum doctors had called it coincidence. The townsfolk called it a curse. "Will you be needing help with your belongings, sir?" the driver asked, already backing away, eyes darting nervously toward the manor's windows. "No," Elias replied, lifting his single leather suitcase. "I travel light these days." The driver nodded, hastily climbing back onto his seat. "God be with you, Mr. Dellinger," he muttered, though his tone suggested no god had set foot on this property for decades. As the carriage disappeared into the fog, Elias turned to face the looming structure. Dellinger Manor had been built by his great-great-grandfather, Isaiah Dellinger, in 1789, using timber from the surrounding forest and stone quarried from land that, according to local legend, had been stolen from the Lenape tribe through bloodshed and deceit. The manor's Victorian architecture, with its steep gables and ornate trim, had once been the pride of the county. Now, it stood as a monument to decay, its paint peeling like diseased skin, windows clouded with grime and neglect. The front door creaked open before Elias could reach for the tarnished brass knocker. "Master Elias," a thin voice called from the darkness, "we've been expecting you." Mrs. Winters stood in the doorway, her gaunt frame silhouetted against the dim light of the entrance hall. At 73, the housekeeper had served 3 generations of Dellingers, witnessing each of their tragic ends. Her eyes, once bright blue, had faded to the color of dishwater, yet they still held a sharpness that made Elias uncomfortable. "Mrs. Winters," he acknowledged, with a slight nod. "I didn't realize anyone still maintained the property." "The Dellinger estate pays for basic upkeep," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter, "though I'm afraid much has fallen into disrepair since your departure." The entrance hall smelled of dust and wood rot, with undertones of something sweeter, almost cloying, like overripe fruit. Elias removed his hat, revealing a shock of prematurely graying hair and a thin scar that ran from his right temple to his jawline. A souvenir from his more violent days at the asylum. "Your room has been prepared," Mrs. Winters continued, leading him toward the grand staircase. "The east wing remains closed, as per your father's instructions before his passing." Elias paused at the foot of the stairs, his gaze drawn to the portrait hanging above the fireplace. It depicted Isaiah Dellinger, the family patriarch, standing proudly beside his wife and infant son. The artist had captured Isaiah's stern countenance perfectly. The sharp cheekbones, the deep-set eyes, the thin lips pressed into what might have been a smile or a grimace. But something about the painting seemed different from what Elias remembered. "Has that portrait been restored?" he asked, taking a step closer. Mrs. Winters glanced at the painting, her expression unreadable. "No, sir. Nothing has been touched. I could have sworn his eyes were—" Elias trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind. The asylum has left my memory somewhat unreliable." As they ascended the creaking staircase, Elias felt a familiar sensation, the weight of unseen eyes following his movements. He had felt it as a child, wandering these same halls, before his father had deemed him too unstable, too dangerous to remain. "Your father's study remains locked," Mrs. Winters informed him as they reached the second-floor landing. "The key is in the drawer of your bedside table, along with his personal effects that were deemed appropriate for you to receive." "Deemed appropriate by whom?" Elias asked, an edge creeping into his voice. "By the family lawyer, Mr. Hargrove. He'll be calling tomorrow to discuss your inheritance and the conditions attached to it." They stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of the hallway. Mrs. Winters produced an iron key from her apron pocket and unlocked it, revealing a spacious bedroom that had clearly been recently dusted and aired. A four-poster bed dominated the center, its dark wood matching the rest of the furniture. A writing desk, a wardrobe, and a bookshelf filled with volumes Elias recognized from his childhood. "This was my mother's room," he said quietly. "Yes," Mrs. Winters confirmed. "Your father never set foot in here after her passing. Said the air felt wrong." Elias set his suitcase on the bed and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtains. The view overlooked the family cemetery, where small headstones dotted the hillside like teeth in a rotting mouth. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, stood the old willow tree, where his cousin Thomas had been found hanging in 1842. His feet dangling a full 6 inches above the ground, despite no visible means of having climbed the tree. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Mrs. Winters asked from the doorway. "No, thank you," Elias replied, not turning from the window. "Though I am curious, why did you stay all these years, after everything that's happened to this family?" The old woman was silent for so long that Elias thought she might have left. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to little more than a whisper. "Some houses, Master Elias, don't let you leave once they've claimed you." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Elias alone with the shadows that seemed to pulse in the corners of the room. He moved to the bedside table and opened the drawer, finding a brass key and a leather-bound journal. The journal's cover was worn smooth from handling, the pages yellowed with age. On the first page, written in his father's precise handwriting, were the words, "For my son, Elias, may you succeed where I failed. The bloodline must end with you." Elias closed the journal, a chill running down his spine despite the room's stuffiness. Outside, thunder rumbled across the hills, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the window pane. As he unpacked his meager belongings, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him, assessing him, like a predator sizing up its prey. In the hallway, the floorboards creaked as if under the weight of footsteps, though Mrs. Winters had long since retired to her quarters in the servants' wing. And from somewhere deep within the walls came a sound like breathing, slow, rhythmic, patient. Elias Dellinger had returned home, and the house had been waiting. Morning arrived with reluctance, grey light filtering through the fog that clung to Dellinger Manor like a shroud. Elias awoke with a start, his nightshirt damp with sweat despite the room's chill. In his dreams, he had wandered the East Wing, the Forbidden Wing, where doors opened onto rooms that shouldn't exist and corridors stretched into impossible geometries. At the end of one such corridor, he had found a nursery where every cradle contained a small, withered corpse, each bearing the unmistakable Dellinger features: the high forehead, the sharp chin, the deep-set eyes that seemed to follow him even in death. He sat up, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes until stars burst behind his eyelids. The doctors at Blackwood had warned him that nightmares might persist even after his release, a side effect of the treatments and the gradual reduction of his medications. But these dreams felt different, more vivid, more purposeful. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Breakfast is served in the morning room, sir," Mrs. Winters called through the door. "And Mr. Hargrove has sent word that he'll arrive at 11. "Thank you," Elias replied, his voice rough with sleep. "I'll be down shortly." After dressing in one of his father's old suits, found hanging in the wardrobe, preserved as if waiting for his return, Elias made his way downstairs. The morning light did little to soften the manor's oppressive atmosphere. If anything, it highlighted the decay. Water stains on the ceiling, cracks in the plaster, the faded patterns of once vibrant wallpaper. The morning room was located at the back of the house, its large windows overlooking what had once been a formal garden, but was now an overgrown tangle of weeds and brambles. A small table had been set with a modest breakfast of toast, eggs, and coffee. As Elias took his seat, he noticed a folded newspaper beside his plate. The Millbrook Gazette, dated the previous day, featured a small article on the front page. Last of the Dellingers returns. Elias Dellinger, sole surviving heir to the infamous Dellinger fortune, has been released from Blackwood Asylum after a decade of confinement. Sources close to the family lawyer confirm that Dellinger has returned to claim his inheritance, despite local superstitions surrounding the property and its troubled history. Readers will recall the tragic circumstances of the Dellinger family, whose male heirs have met with untimely and often violent ends for generations. Elias set the paper aside, his appetite diminishing. He had hoped for some measure of privacy, but in a town as small as Millbrook, such hopes were foolish. No doubt his return was already the subject of gossip in every parlor and tavern. As he sipped his coffee, bitter and oversteeped, his gaze was drawn to a small door at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a heavy curtain. He didn't recall it from his childhood, but then again, certain parts of the house had been strictly off-limits to him as a boy. Curiosity piqued, he rose from the table and crossed to the door. It was smaller than standard, perhaps 5 feet tall, with no visible handle or keyhole. The wood was darker than the surrounding paneling, almost black, and carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "That door doesn't open, sir." Elias turned to find Mrs. Winters standing in the doorway, a silver coffee pot in her gnarled hands. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the pot's handle. "It's not a door at all," she continued, moving to refill his cup. "Just a decorative panel, part of the original construction." "Strange place for decoration," Elias observed, running his fingers along the carvings. They felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, despite the room's chill. "The Dellingers have always had unusual tastes in architecture," Mrs. Winters replied. Her eyes never left the door as she spoke. "Your great-great-grandfather was said to have designed the house himself, incorporating elements from his travels abroad. To where? Places best not discussed at breakfast, sir." She set the coffee pot down with a finality that suggested the conversation was over. "Mr. Hargrove will be here soon. Perhaps you'd like to review your father's journal before he arrives?" Elias nodded, recognizing the deflection but choosing not to press. He returned to his seat, though he could still feel the warmth of the carvings lingering on his fingertips. After breakfast, he retreated to his father's study, using the brass key from the bedside drawer to unlock the heavy oak door. The room beyond was exactly as he remembered it from childhood. Walls lined with bookshelves, a massive desk positioned before the window, leather chairs worn smooth from use. The air smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, with undertones of the same sweet rot scent that permeated the rest of the house. Elias settled into his father's chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight, and opened the journal he'd found the night before. His father's handwriting filled page after page, neat and precise at first, then increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. Most detailed mundane business matters, crop yields from tenant farms, investments in railroad stocks, disputes with neighboring landowners. But interspersed among these were stranger entries, often written in a different ink, sometimes in what appeared to be code or a foreign language. One entry, dated 3 months before Elias's commitment to Blackwood, caught his eye. "E spoke of the figures again today. Claims they stand at the foot of his bed each night, whispering. Dr. Morris suggests increased doses of laudanum, but I fear it only dulls his awareness without stopping what's happening. The pattern repeats itself, just as it did with Thomas, with my father, with all of them. The blood calls to blood. I've consulted the book again, but the pages relevant to our situation remain indecipherable. Perhaps that's for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous, even in pursuit of breaking the cycle. The east wing grows colder despite the summer heat. Something is gathering strength there, waiting. I've sealed off the nursery completely. No one is to enter under any circumstances. Elias frowned, trying to recall the figures his father had mentioned. His memories of the time before Blackwood were fragmented at best, flashes of terror, arguments overheard through doors. His father's face contorted with a mixture of fear and resignation. The asylum doctors had attributed his condition to hereditary madness, pointing to the Dellinger history of mental instability as evidence. But his father's journal suggested something else, something his father had understood, or at least suspected. A knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Hargrove has arrived, sir," Mrs. Winters announced. "He's waiting in the drawing room." Elias closed the journal and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. I'll see him now." The drawing room, like much of the house, had seen better days. Once elegant furniture was now faded and worn, the grand piano in the corner yellowed with age and neglect. Tall windows looked out over the front drive, where a sleek black carriage waited, its driver huddled against the persistent drizzle. Silas Hargrove stood by the fireplace, warming his hands over flames that did little to dispel the room's dampness. At 65, he was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed white beard. The Hargrove family had served as lawyers to the Dellingers for 4 generations, almost as if bound by the same curse, though their fates had been considerably less tragic. "Elias," Hargrove greeted him, extending a hand. "It's good to see you looking so improved." "Improved compared to what, Mr. Hargrove?" Elias asked, accepting the handshake. "The raving lunatic you helped commit to Blackwood?" Hargrove had the decency to look uncomfortable. "That was your father's decision, not mine. I merely facilitated the legal aspects." "Of course." Elias gestured to a pair of armchairs. "Shall we discuss my inheritance? I understand there are conditions." They sat, and Hargrove produced a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "Your father was very specific about the terms of his will," he began, extracting several documents. "The Dellinger estate, including the manor, surrounding lands, investments, and accounts, passes to you as the sole heir. However, there are stipulations." He handed Elias a document bearing his father's familiar signature. "First, you must reside at Dellinger Manor for a minimum of 1 year before gaining full control of the assets. Second, you are forbidden from selling or otherwise disposing of the property during your lifetime. Third, and most importantly, you must not marry or produce children." Elias looked up sharply. "He wanted the Dellinger line to end with me." "Yes," Hargrove confirmed, his expression grave. "Your father was most insistent on that point. Should you father a child, the entire estate will be placed in trust for charitable purposes, and you will receive only a modest stipend for the remainder of your life." "Did he explain why?" Hargrove hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "Your father believed the Dellinger bloodline was tainted in some way. He spoke of a curse, though I attributed such talk to grief in advancing age. He had, after all, lost his wife, his brother, and effectively his son within the span of a few years." "And you never questioned why so many Dellingers met tragic ends?" Elias pressed. "Never wondered if there might be truth to the local superstitions?" "I am a man of law, not superstition," Hargrove replied stiffly, "though I will admit that the statistical improbability of so many accidents and illnesses befalling one family is noteworthy." The thunder rumbled overhead, and the lights flickered momentarily. From somewhere deep within the house came a sound like wood splintering, followed by a heavy thud. "What was that?" Hargrove asked, half rising from his chair. "Old houses make noises," Elias replied calmly, though his heart had begun to race, "especially in storms." Hargrove settled back, clearly uncomfortable. "There is one more matter," he said, producing a small brass key from his waistcoat pocket. "Your father entrusted this to me with instructions that it be given to you upon your return. It opens a safe in the library, behind the portrait of Isaiah Dellinger." Elias accepted the key, noting that it was similar to the one that had opened his father's study. "Did he say what's inside?" "Only that it contains information vital to understanding your family's situation." Hargrove closed his portfolio with a snap. "I've fulfilled my obligations, Elias. The rest is up to you. But I would caution you, your father was not a superstitious man by nature. If he believed there was danger in the Dellinger bloodline continuing, perhaps there was reason for his concern." After Hargrove's departure, Elias made his way to the library, a cavernous room lined with bookshelves that reached to the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the shafts of grey light that penetrated the tall windows, and the air smelled of mildew and leather bindings. The portrait of Isaiah Dellinger hung above the marble fireplace, dominating the room with its imposing presence. Unlike the painting in the entrance hall, this one showed Isaiah alone, seated in what appeared to be this very library. His expression was severe, almost challenging, his eyes seeming to follow Elias as he approached. Carefully, Elias lifted the heavy frame away from the wall, revealing a small wall safe embedded in the plaster. The brass key fit perfectly, turning with a soft click. Inside, he found a single item, a leather-bound book, its cover unmarked except for a strange symbol embossed in gold, a circle containing an intricate pattern of lines that seemed to form a stylized tree, or perhaps a web. As Elias withdrew the book, a folded piece of paper fell from between its pages. His father's handwriting was instantly recognizable. "Elias, if you are reading this, then I have failed to end our family's curse, and the burden now falls to you." This book came into Isaiah Dellinger's possession in 1787 during his travels in Eastern Europe. It contains knowledge that should have remained buried, knowledge he used to secure our family's fortune and unwittingly seal our doom. Do not read it in the house. Do not speak of its contents to anyone. And above all, do not attempt to use what you learn from it. The price is too high. The East Wing holds the physical manifestation of our sin. It must remain sealed. Should the barriers fail, burn the house to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. I am sorry for what I did to you, son. I thought I was protecting you, but I was only delaying the inevitable. The blood calls to blood, and the debt must be paid. Your father Elias stared at the letter, a cold weight settling in his stomach. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows like desperate fingers seeking entry. And from the direction of the East Wing, the sealed wing, came the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, high and clear and utterly impossible. The book felt unnaturally warm in his hands, almost alive. As he tucked it into his jacket alongside his father's journal, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set something in motion, something that had been waiting for his return all these years. In the portrait above the fireplace, Isaiah Dellinger's painted eyes seemed to gleam with satisfaction. The storm showed no signs of abating as evening approached, transforming the grounds of Dellinger Manor into a sodden wasteland. From his position at the library window, Elias watched lightning fork across the sky, briefly illuminating the family cemetery on the hillside. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw figures moving among the headstones, their forms indistinct in the downpour. The book from the safe lay on the desk behind him, still unopened. He had spent the afternoon poring over his father's journal instead, searching for clues about the curse that had plagued the Dellinger line. The entries grew increasingly erratic in the months leading up to Elias's commitment to Blackwood, filled with references to the bargain, the debt, and the hunger in the walls. His father had been convinced that the East Wing was the epicenter of whatever malevolence haunted their family, that something was growing stronger there, feeding on the Dellinger bloodline. A soft knock at the library door pulled Elias from his thoughts. "Dinner is served, sir, Mrs." Winters announced, her thin frame silhouetted against the hallway light. "Though I'm afraid it's a simple affair. The storm has prevented the delivery of fresh provisions from town." "That's fine, Mrs. Winters," Elias replied, gathering the journal and the mysterious book. "I'm not particularly hungry." The old woman's gaze lingered on the items in his hands, her expression unreadable. "Finding answers, are you, sir?" "Perhaps," Elias said carefully. "Did you know my father well, Mrs. Winters?" "I served him for 30 years, she replied. "I watched him change from a hopeful young man to what he became at the end." "And what was that exactly?" Mrs. Winters was silent for a long moment, her rheumy eyes fixed on the portrait of Isaiah Dellinger. "Afraid," she finally said. "Not for himself, but for you. He believed he could end it, you see, break the pattern. That's why he sent you away, to protect me, to protect the world from what you might become." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "The East Wing has been sealed for a reason, Master Elias. Some doors are meant to stay closed." After a sparse dinner of canned soup and stale bread, Elias retired to his room with the book and journal. Rain continued to batter the windows, and wind howled through the eaves like a living thing in pain. The electricity flickered intermittently, threatening to plunge the manor into darkness at any moment. Sitting at the writing desk, Elias finally opened the mysterious book from the safe. Its pages were made of a material he couldn't identify, not quite paper, not quite parchment, with a texture that reminded him uncomfortably of skin. The text was written in multiple languages, some recognizable, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, others completely foreign to him. Interspersed among the text were diagrams and illustrations of disturbing anatomical precision. Human figures with organs exposed, strange symbols carved into flesh, rituals involving blood and bone. One section, marked with the same tree-like symbol that adorned the cover, had been partially translated into English in the margins. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, nothing like Isaiah Dellinger's confident script from the portraits. "Blood of the bloodline, freely given, opens the way. What passes through cannot be undone. The exchange is permanent. Prosperity for progeny. The firstborn of each generation serves as vessel and sustenance until the debt is paid in full." Elias frowned, trying to make sense of the cryptic notes. They suggested some kind of bargain or ritual, one involving blood sacrifice and something passing between worlds. Had Isaiah Dellinger, the family patriarch, performed such a ritual to secure the family's fortune? And if so, what exactly had he invited into their bloodline? A sudden crash from the hallway startled him from his thoughts. Setting the book aside, Elias moved cautiously to the door and opened it a crack. The corridor beyond was dark, the electricity having finally succumbed to the storm. In the dim light from his room, he could make out a fallen painting on the floor, its frame shattered. As he bent to examine it, he realized it was a family portrait, one he didn't recall seeing before. It showed a man and woman with a young boy of perhaps 5 or 6. The man's face had been scratched out with such violence that the canvas was torn, but the woman and child were untouched. The boy bore a striking resemblance to Elias himself at that age, with the same solemn expression and deep-set eyes. "That's not possible," he murmured, studying the painting more closely. The woman wore clothing from the mid-1800s, placing the portrait at least 50 years before his birth, yet the resemblance was uncanny, as if he were looking at himself across time. A soft sound drew his attention further down the hallway, toward the east wing. It was a gentle scraping, like fingernails against wood. Elias straightened, straining to see through the darkness. At the far end of the corridor, where it turned toward the sealed wing, he caught a glimpse of movement, a small, pale shape disappearing around the corner. Against his better judgment, Elias followed, guided by occasional flashes of lightning through the windows. The air grew noticeably colder as he approached the junction, where the main hallway met the corridor leading to the east wing. Here, a heavy oak door barred the way, secured with multiple locks and what appeared to be newer additions, steel reinforcing plates and a modern deadbolt. The scraping sound came again, this time from directly behind the door. Then a voice, high and clear, unmistakably a child's. "Father, is that you, Father? I'm cold, please let me in." Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was eerily familiar, though he couldn't place why. "Who's there?" he called, his own voice barely above a whisper. Silence stretched for several seconds, broken only by the storm's fury outside. Then, "You know who I am, Father. You made me. Let me in. I'm so cold." A flash of lightning illuminated the corridor, and in that instant, Elias saw something impossible. Fingers, small, childlike fingers, emerging from beneath the door, reaching toward him across the floor. They were unnaturally pale, almost translucent, with blackened nails that scraped against the wooden floorboards. Elias stumbled backward, nearly falling in his haste to retreat. The fingers continued to reach, stretching impossibly far from under the door, grasping at air. "Father, please!" the voice called, now tinged with desperation. "The others hurt me. They're always hurting me. Only you can make them stop." Another flash of lightning, and the fingers were gone. The voice fell silent. But as Elias turned to flee back to the safety of his room, he caught sight of wet footprints on the floor, small like a child's, leading not away from the east wing door, but toward it, as if something had entered rather than exited. Back in his room, Elias double-locked his door and pushed a heavy dresser against it for good measure. His hands shook as he poured himself a generous measure of brandy from a decanter on the writing desk. The encounter had left him chilled to the bone, his mind racing with implications he didn't want to face. The book lay open where he'd left it, its pages now turned to a different section, one he was certain he hadn't been reading. This page featured an illustration of a ritual circle, at the center of which stood a man cutting his palm over what appeared to be a cradle. Around the circle, shadowy figures reached inward with elongated limbs. The accompanying text was in Latin, but one phrase had been underlined and translated: "Blood calls to blood across the veil." Elias slammed the book shut, his breathing ragged. He needed answers, concrete answers, not cryptic warnings and supernatural encounters that could be attributed to an overactive imagination or the lingering effects of asylum medications. Taking a steadying breath, he retrieved his father's journal and began to read more carefully, focusing on entries from the months immediately preceding his commitment to Blackwood. One passage, dated just 2 weeks before Elias had been taken away, stood out. E found his way into the East Wing yesterday despite the locks, claims he was following the other children. When questioned, he described with perfect clarity the nursery that has been sealed for over a century, down to the mobile above the cradle, a detail recorded in no family history, known only to those who have seen it with their own eyes. He spoke of the hungry ones who live in the walls and of a baby that cries without ceasing. Most disturbing, he referred to Isaiah as Father and claimed to remember when the house was built. Doctor Morris suggests these are fabrications born of an unstable mind, perhaps influenced by household gossip, but I know better. The blood is awakening in him, just as it did in me, in my father, in all of us. The difference is that E seems to welcome it. I've consulted the book again. There may be a way to sever his connection, to spare him from what awaits the Dellinger heirs. It will require sacrifice, but I'm prepared to pay that price. Better that my son hate me for committing him than suffer the fate that awaits him here. Elias set the journal down, a cold realization dawning. His father hadn't committed him out of cruelty or embarrassment. He'd been trying to protect him from whatever lurked in the East Wing, whatever had been claiming Dellinger heirs for generations. And now, by returning to the manor, Elias had placed himself directly in its path. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the lamp on his bedside table, plunging the room into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning. In that darkness, Elias became acutely aware of sounds he had been subconsciously ignoring. The subtle shifting of the house around him, like a body settling, the whisper of movement within the walls, the soft rhythmic tapping that might have been rain against the window, or fingers against wood. And beneath it all, almost too faint to perceive, the sound of a child humming a lullaby. Elias remained motionless, scarcely breathing, as the humming grew gradually louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. The melody was hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't place it. Then, in a flash of lightning that turned night to day for a heartbeat, he saw them, figures standing in each corner of his room, small, child-sized silhouettes with elongated limbs and features that shifted like smoke when viewed directly. They were perfectly still, watching him with eyes that reflected the lightning like those of nocturnal animals. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, and when it faded, the figures were gone. But the humming remained, now accompanied by words sung in a child's sweet voice. "Hush now, father dear, the hungry ones are near, they'll take your eyes and take your breath, and rock you gently unto death." With trembling hands, Elias relit the lamp, casting warm light across the room. There was no sign of the figures, no evidence they had ever been there, except for the lingering chill in the air and the racing of his heart. He turned back to his father's journal, desperately seeking answers. The final entry, dated the day before Elias's commitment, contained just 3 lines. "It's too late for me, but not for him. The hunger has found me instead. If he returns after my death, the book will show him the way. God forgive me for what I've done to my son, and for what I failed to undo of my father's sin." Elias closed the journal, his mind reeling. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever bargain Isaiah Dellinger had made, it was still unfolding, still claiming victims from the family line. And now it had set its sights on him. He needed to see the East Wing. Despite the warnings, despite the danger, he needed to understand what was sealed away there, what had been feeding on Dellinger blood for generations. As if in response to his thoughts, a key materialized on the writing desk beside the journal, an ornate iron key that hadn't been there moments before. It was black with age, its bow shaped like a child's silhouette, its teeth complex and unusual. Elias stared at it, not daring to touch it. He hadn't imagined the figures in his room. They had left this for him, an invitation or a trap. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, wind howling like a living thing in pain. The manor groaned and shifted around him, timbers creaking under strain. From somewhere deep in the house came the sound of breaking glass, followed by Mrs. Winter's startled cry. Concern for the elderly housekeeper overrode Elias's fear. Grabbing the lamp, he shoved the mysterious key into his pocket and hurried from the room, leaving the book and journal behind. "Mrs. Winters," he called, making his way cautiously down the darkened hallway. "Are you all right?" No answer came. But as he descended the grand staircase, he spotted a light moving in the entrance hall below, the wavering flame of a candle held in Mrs. Winter's gnarled hand. The old woman stood before the portrait of Isaiah Dellinger, her face upturned, lips moving in what appeared to be conversation. "Mrs. Winters?" Elias called again, louder this time. She turned slowly, her expression blank, eyes reflecting the candlelight like polished glass. "They're restless tonight," she said, her voice oddly flat. "The storm always makes them restless." "Who's restless?" Elias asked, reaching the bottom of the stairs. "The children," she replied, as if it were obvious. "They've been waiting for you. For so long, they've waited." A chill ran down Elias's spine. "What children, Mrs. Winters? There are no children here." The old woman smiled, a terrible, empty smile that transformed her familiar face into something alien. "Oh, but there are, Master Elias. So many children, all with your eyes, all with your blood." She stepped closer, the candle flame casting grotesque shadows across her features. "They were supposed to be vessels, you see. Each generation, one child to house the hunger. That was the bargain. But Isaiah didn't understand what he was calling forth. It wasn't satisfied with just one. It wanted all of them, all of you." "Mrs. Winters, you're not making sense," Elias said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Perhaps you should sit down." "I've served this house for 50 years, she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I've watched them take your grandfather, your uncle, your cousins. I've heard the crying from the East Wing every night for half a century, and now you've come home to them, just as the Master said you would." "My father!" "No," she whispered, leaning closer. "The first Master, Isaiah. He speaks from the walls, from the portraits. He's been waiting for you specifically, Master Elias, the last of his line, the final vessel." A tremendous crash shook the house, the sound of a tree falling against the structure. The impact knocked Mrs. Winters off balance, sending her stumbling forward. The candle fell from her hand, rolling across the floor and extinguishing, plunging the entrance hall into darkness. Elias fumbled with his lamp, raising it to locate the housekeeper. "Mrs. Winters?" No response came. The entrance hall was empty, save for himself and the looming portrait of Isaiah Dellinger, which seemed to watch him with newfound intensity. A soft sound drew his attention to the corridor leading toward the kitchen, the shuffle of slippered feet on hardwood. Raising his lamp higher, Elias followed, calling for Mrs. Winters again. The kitchen was dark and cold, the hearth fire long extinguished. Rain lashed against the windows and wind whistled through gaps in the aging structure. There was no sign of the housekeeper, but the back door stood open, swinging gently in the gale. Elias approached cautiously, raising his lamp to peer into the storm-lashed night. Lightning illuminated the scene in strobing flashes, the overgrown garden, the path leading to the servants' quarters, and a figure, Mrs. Winters, walking with unnatural steadiness toward the family cemetery on the hillside. "Mrs. Winters, stop!" Elias called, but his voice was lost in the howling wind. He hesitated at the threshold, torn between pursuing the elderly woman into the storm and the instinctive knowledge that doing so would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. As he watched, Mrs. Winters reached the cemetery gate and passed through it, her white nightgown billowing around her like a shroud. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant, Elias saw that she was not alone. Figures moved among the headstones, small, child-sized silhouettes that seemed to flow rather than walk, surrounding the old woman as she made her way deeper into the graveyard. The back door slammed shut with such force that Elias was thrown backward, the lamp flying from his hand and shattering against the stone floor. Fire bloomed instantly, feeding on spilled oil and the dry wooden cabinets nearby. Elias scrambled to his feet, searching frantically for something to extinguish the rapidly spreading flames. But as he turned toward the sink, he froze. Standing between him and the water was a child. The boy appeared to be about 6 years old, dressed in clothing from another century. His features were Dellinger features, the high forehead, the deep-set eyes, the sharp chin. But his skin was wrong. Too pale, almost translucent, with blue veins visible beneath. And his eyes were solid black, like pools of ink. "Hello, Father," the child said, his voice the same one Elias had heard through the East Wing door. "I've been waiting for you to come home." Elias backed away, the heat of the growing fire intense against his back. "Who are you?" The child tilted his head, an unnaturally fluid movement. "I'm you, Father, a piece of you. a piece of all of us. He smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Isaiah made us, and now we're hungry. The boy took a step forward, and as he did, his form seemed to ripple and distort, limbs elongating, fingers stretching into claws. Behind him, more figures appeared in the doorway. Children of various ages, all with the same Dellinger features, all with the same wrong skin and black eyes. Elias turned and ran, fleeing through the burning kitchen into the dining room beyond. Behind him, he heard the patter of small feet and the high, excited laughter of children at play. The sound was all wrong, too eager, too hungry. He raced through the house, pursued by the sound of small running feet and childish giggles that echoed from every direction. The fire was spreading rapidly, smoke beginning to fill the corridors. As he reached the grand staircase, Elias glanced back to see the first tendrils of flame licking along the hallway from the kitchen. Burn the house to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. His father's words echoed in his mind. Perhaps that had been the plan all along, to let the house burn, taking its secrets and its hunger with it. But something told Elias it wouldn't be that simple. Whatever dwelled here, whatever Isaiah Dellinger had invited into their bloodline, it wouldn't be destroyed by mere fire. He needed the book, needed to understand what his ancestor had done and how to undo it. Taking the stairs two at a time, Elias raced back to his room, slamming and locking the door behind him. The book and journal lay where he'd left them, illuminated by flashes of lightning through the window. Gathering them quickly, Elias turned to leave and found his path blocked. The child from the kitchen stood before the door, but he had changed. His limbs were impossibly long now, his fingers ending in talons that scraped against the wooden floor. His mouth had widened to accommodate rows of needle-like teeth, and his black eyes had grown to consume most of his face. "You can't leave, Father," the thing said, its voice still chillingly childlike despite its monstrous appearance. "None of us can leave. That was the bargain." "What bargain?" Elias demanded, clutching the book to his chest. "What did Isaiah do?" The creature tilted its misshapen head. "He wanted wealth, power, a legacy. He offered blood, his children's blood, his children's children's blood, one child from each generation to feed the hunger. But the hunger grew. It always grows." It took a step forward, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. "We're all here, Father. Every Dellinger child that was fed to the hunger. We're in the walls, in the floors, in the very air you breathe. And now you'll join us." Smoke was beginning to seep under the door, the fire spreading faster than should have been possible. Elias glanced frantically around the room, seeking escape. The window was his only option, a two-story drop to the ground below, potentially fatal, but preferable to what awaited him in the room. As he lunged for the window, the creature moved with impossible speed, intercepting him, its elongated arms wrapped around him, cold and strong as iron bands. The book and journal fell from his grasp as he struggled against its grip. "The East Wing," the creature whispered, its breath cold against Elias's ear. "The answers are in the East Wing. Where it all began, where it will end." With that, it released him so suddenly that Elias stumbled backward, nearly falling. When he regained his balance, the creature was gone, but the iron key from his pocket now lay on the floor at his feet, gleaming in the lightning flashes. Smoke was filling the room rapidly now, making it difficult to breathe. The fire had reached the hallway outside. He could hear the crackle and roar of flames, consuming the ancient wood. There would be no escaping that way. Elias snatched up the key, book and journal, then turned to the window. Using a chair from the writing desk, he smashed the glass and cleared the frame of jagged shards. The storm raged outside, rain and wind immediately soaking the curtains and floor. He hesitated, looking back at the smoke-filled room. Part of him, a growing part, wanted to stay, to let the fire take him and end the Dellinger line once and for all. But another part, the part that had survived 10 years in Blackwood Asylum, refused to surrender without understanding what he was surrendering to. Taking a deep breath, Elias climbed through the window onto the narrow ledge beyond. The drop was substantial, but a trellis of ancient ivy offered a potential route to the ground. As he began his precarious descent, he glanced up at the east wing, the sealed section of the house that had remained forbidden for generations. A light burned in one of its windows, a warm, inviting glow that stood in stark contrast to the storm and the spreading fire. And silhouetted against that light was a figure, a woman in old-fashioned dress, her hand pressed longingly against the glass. For an instant, their eyes met across the gulf of rain and darkness. Then lightning struck nearby, temporarily blinding Elias. When his vision cleared, the figure was gone, and the window was dark once more. The ivy trellis gave way under his weight when he was still 10 feet from the ground. Elias fell hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs and sending pain shooting through his ankle. The book and journal tumbled from his grasp, landing in the mud nearby. As he lay there, struggling to breathe, a voice carried to him on the wind, Mrs. Winters, calling his name from the direction of the cemetery. Her tone was wrong, though, too eager, too hungry. Gathering the book and journal, Elias forced himself to his feet, wincing at the pain in his injured ankle. The manor was now fully engulfed in flames, fire pouring from windows and climbing toward the roof. The heat was intense, even from where he stood, the roar of the inferno competing with the storm's fury. But the east wing remained untouched by the flames, as if protected by some invisible barrier. The iron key felt heavy in Elias's pocket, pulling him toward that forbidden section of the house like a lodestone. Lightning illuminated the scene again, and in that flash, Elias saw them. Dozens of figures standing at the edge of the woods surrounding the property. Children of all ages, all with Dellinger features, all watching him with black, hungry eyes. Among them stood Mrs. Winters, her nightgown soaked with rain and something darker, her eyes as black and empty as those of the children surrounding her. "Come home, Master Elias." Her voice carried on the wind, though her lips didn't move. "Come home to us." The figures began to advance, slowly, inexorably, moving as one toward him. Clutching the book and journal tightly, Elias turned and limped toward the only part of Dellinger Manor that remained untouched by the flames, the east wing, where it had all begun, and where, one way or another, it would end. The east wing's entrance was hidden behind a tangle of overgrown shrubbery that had clearly been left untended for decades. Unlike the grand facade of the main house, this section was built of darker stone, with narrow windows set deep into the walls, like suspicious eyes. A small door, almost invisible beneath a curtain of ivy, appeared to be the only way in. Elias glanced back at the burning manor, flames now engulfing the roof and sending sparks spiraling into the storm-lashed sky. The figures from the woods had reached the garden, their progress slow but relentless, moving with the inevitable patience of those who know their prey has nowhere to run. The iron key felt unnaturally cold in Elias's hand as he approached the east wing door. It fit the ancient lock perfectly, turning with surprising ease, despite decades of disuse. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing darkness beyond. Elias hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct warned against entering, against stepping willingly into what was clearly a trap. But the alternatives, facing the burning manor or the advancing horde of hungry children, were equally fatal. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click that sounded horribly final. The interior of the east wing was nothing like Elias had expected. While the main house had been decaying, this section appeared perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped here a century ago. Oil lamps burned in wall sconces, casting warm light over pristine wallpaper and polished wood floors. The air smelled of beeswax and lavender, with no hint of the smoke that should have been seeping in from the burning structure mere yards away. Elias moved cautiously down the corridor, his injured ankle throbbing with each step. The walls were lined with portraits, all Dellingers judging by their features, though many were unfamiliar to him. Children predominated, solemn-faced boys and girls in clothing from various eras, all with the same deep-set eyes and high foreheads. None appeared older than 12. At the end of the corridor stood a single door, white with gold trim, adorned with a hand-painted mural of a tree whose branches formed a complex pattern similar to the symbol on the book's cover. Beneath the tree, small figures danced in a circle, their features indistinct, but their postures suggesting celebration or ritual. As Elias approached, he heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a music box playing a lullaby. The same melody the child had sung earlier. "Hush now, father dear, the hungry ones are near." The door was unlocked, opening at his touch to reveal a nursery straight from the previous century. A large cradle dominated the center of the room, draped with fine lace and silk ribbons. Above it hung an elaborate mobile of carved wooden figures, children holding hands in a circle, slowly rotating though there was no breeze to move them. The music came from an ornate box on the dresser, its lid open to reveal a miniature scene, a man cutting his palm over a cradle while shadowy figures watched from the corners of the room. The figurine rotated slowly as the music played, its tiny face a perfect replica of Isaiah Dellinger's from the portraits. But it was the far wall that drew Elias's attention and sent ice through his veins. It was covered floor to ceiling with names and dates, hundreds of them, written in what appeared to be blood. Each entry followed the same format, a name, a birth date, and a death date. All Dellingers, all children, none having lived past their 12th year, and at the bottom, freshly written, still glistening wetly in the lamplight, Elias Dellinger, 1850. The date of death remained incomplete. "It's been waiting for you to complete the pattern." Elias whirled around, nearly losing his balance on his injured ankle. A woman stood by the cradle, the same woman he had glimpsed in the east wing window during his escape from the burning manor. She wore a high-necked dress of deep burgundy, her dark hair piled atop her head in the fashion of the mid-1800s. Her features were delicate but unmistakably Dellinger, and her eyes held a profound sadness. "Who are you?" Elias asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Eleanor Dellinger," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "Isaiah's wife, the first to understand what he had done and the first to try to undo it." "You're dead," Elias stated flatly. "You've been dead for over a century." A sad smile touched her lips. "Death is not what you think it is in this house, Elias. None of us truly die here. We merely change form." She gestured to the wall of names. "Every Dellinger child born since Isaiah made his bargain has been claimed by the hunger. Their bodies die, but their essence remains, trapped, transformed, fed upon by what dwells between the walls." "What did he do?" Elias demanded, clutching the book tightly. "What bargain did Isaiah make?" Eleanor's gaze dropped to the cradle. "We could not have children," she said softly. 10 years of marriage, and my womb remained barren. Isaiah was the last of his line, desperate for an heir to carry on his name and inherit the fortune he had built. He became obsessed with finding a solution, any solution." She moved to the music box, closing its lid and silencing the eerie melody. "During his travels in Eastern Europe, he acquired that book you hold, a grimoire containing rituals and invocations deemed too dangerous even by those who practiced the dark arts. One ritual promised fertility and an unbroken lineage in exchange for tribute, blood sacrifice," Elias said, remembering the illustrations he had seen. "Not just blood," Eleanor corrected. "Essence, soul." The ritual required that one child from each generation be given wholly to what Isaiah summoned, an entity that feeds on potential, on futures unlived, on dreams unrealized. In return, the Dellinger line would prosper and continue unbroken. But it didn't work that way, Elias guessed. "No," Eleanor agreed, her expression darkening. The entity Isaiah summoned was ancient and cunning. It granted us a son, our precious Thomas, but its hunger was not satisfied with just one child per generation. It wanted all of them. It began to influence the Dellinger heirs, calling to the blood that connected them to it. Madness, they called it. The Dellinger madness, passed down through generations. She turned to the wall of names. Some fought it, some embraced it, but all were claimed in the end. The entity feeds on them slowly, savoring their essence over decades, keeping them suspended between life and death. That's what you've been seeing, fragments of Dellinger children, neither fully alive nor truly dead, puppeted by the hunger that dwells in this house. Elias thought of the child in the kitchen, of the figures in the woods, of Mrs. Winters with her black, empty eyes. And my father, he knew about this. Your father discovered the truth when he was about your age, Eleanor said. He found the book just as you did. He tried to break the cycle by sending you away, by ensuring you would never have children of your own. He thought if the Dellinger line ended with you, the entity would have no more vessels to fill, no more essence to feed upon. But it lured me back, Elias realized. It needs me to complete the pattern. Eleanor nodded gravely. You are the last, Elias, the last vessel. The entity has been waiting for you, growing stronger on the accumulated essence of generations of Dellinger children, preparing for the moment when it could claim the final descendant and break free of the constraints Isaiah placed upon it. Break free? Elias echoed, a chill running down his spine. What happens then? Its hunger is insatiable, Eleanor said simply. What it has done to the Dellinger line, it will do to others. It will spread, feeding on the essence of children, growing ever stronger. Isaiah didn't understand what he was calling forth, what he was setting loose upon the world. Outside, the storm had reached a fever pitch, wind howling around the east wing like a living thing in pain. Through the nursery's single window, Elias could see that the main house had collapsed in on itself, a smoldering ruin silhouetted against the night sky. And moving through the garden toward the east wing were the figures from before, dozens of them now, children and adults alike, all with black, empty eyes. They're coming, Eleanor said, following his gaze. The fragments, puppeted by the hunger. They'll try to complete the pattern, to make you the final sacrifice. How do I stop it? Elias demanded, holding up the book. There must be a way to end this. Eleanor's expression was grave. There is a way, she confirmed. But the price is high, Elias, higher than you may be willing to pay. Tell me, he insisted, whatever it is, it can't be worse than letting this thing loose on the world. She moved to the cradle, running her fingers along its ornately carved edge. The ritual can be undone, the entity banished back to where it came from, but it requires the willing sacrifice of a Dellinger, not to feed the hunger, but to close the door Isaiah opened. A life freely given, with full knowledge and acceptance of the consequences. My life, Elias said quietly. Yes, Eleanor confirmed, but not just your death, your complete erasure. You would never have existed. The entire Dellinger line would be wiped from history as if it had never been. Is that even possible? The entity exists partially outside of time, Eleanor explained. It feeds on potential, on what might have been. The ritual would use that same power to unmake what was. Isaiah Dellinger would have died childless in 1788, his name forgotten, his legacy erased. Every Dellinger who came after, including you, would be undone. Elias tried to comprehend the enormity of what she was suggesting. Not just death, but complete non-existence. Everyone he had ever known would continue their lives with no memory of him or his family. It would be as if the Dellingers had never been born, had never lived, had never suffered. What do I need to do? He asked, his decision made. Eleanor's eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and pride. The ritual must be performed where it began, here, in this nursery, where Isaiah first cut his palm over our son's cradle and invited the hunger into our bloodline. She moved to the dresser and opened a drawer, removing a silver dagger with a bone handle carved with the same tree-like symbol from the book. Your blood must be given willingly, with full understanding of the sacrifice. The words are in the book, the final pages, which Isaiah tore out, but I preserved. From within the folds of her dress, she produced several yellowed pages, handing them to Elias. The text was written in the same mixture of languages as the rest of the book, but beneath each line, a translation had been carefully added in a feminine hand, Eleanor's presumably. As the last of the line, your sacrifice carries the weight of all who came before, she continued. It will be enough to close the door and send the hunger back to its own realm. A tremendous crash shook the east wing, the sound of the entrance door being broken down. Childish laughter echoed through the corridors, accompanied by the patter of dozens of small running feet. "They're inside," Eleanor said urgently. "You must begin the ritual now, before they reach the nursery." Elias nodded, setting the book and journal aside and taking the dagger and torn pages. The silver blade gleamed in the lamplight, seeming to pulse with its own inner light. "Will it hurt?" he asked, surprising himself with the childlike question. Eleanor's expression softened. "No, dear one. It will feel like falling asleep, and then nothing. No pain, no memory, no existence." The sounds of approach grew louder. Doors opening and closing, furniture being overturned, the hungry giggles drawing ever nearer. "I'll hold them off as long as I can," Eleanor promised, moving toward the nursery door. "Begin the ritual. Don't stop, no matter what you hear or see." As she reached for the door handle, Elias called out, "Wait! Are you real? Or are you part of it? Part of the hunger?" Eleanor turned back, a sad smile on her lips. "I am what remains of the woman who loved her husband, despite his terrible mistake, who loved her son even as she watched the hunger consume him from within, who has waited over a century for someone strong enough to end what Isaiah began." She met his gaze directly. "I am as real as anything in this house, Elias, and I am so very sorry for the burden that has fallen to you." With that, she slipped through the door, closing it firmly behind her. Almost immediately, Elias heard her voice in the corridor beyond, stern, commanding, speaking words in a language he didn't recognize, but which made the air in the nursery vibrate with power. Turning to the task at hand, he studied the ritual described on the torn pages. It was deceptively simple. A circle drawn in the blood of the sacrifice, symbols marked at the cardinal points, words spoken with clear intent and full understanding of their meaning. The dagger was to be plunged into the heart at the ritual's conclusion, sealing the sacrifice and closing the door between worlds. Using the silver dagger, Elias cut his palm deeply, letting the blood pool before beginning to trace the required circle on the nursery floor. The wood seemed to drink his blood eagerly, the red liquid disappearing almost as quickly as it was applied. "Still," he continued, marking the symbols as directed and speaking the words Eleanor had translated. Outside the nursery, chaos erupted. Crashes and thuds shook the walls, accompanied by inhuman shrieks of rage and pain. Eleanor's voice continued its steady chant, though it grew increasingly strained. As Elias completed the circle and began the final invocation, the nursery door burst open. Mrs. Winters stood in the doorway, or what remained of Mrs. Winters. Her body had been twisted and elongated, limbs bent at impossible angles, her mouth stretched to accommodate rows of needle-like teeth. Behind her crowded the children Elias had seen before, their forms similarly distorted, black eyes gleaming with hunger. "Stop him!" shrieked a voice from within Mrs. Winter's ruined form, a voice that was not hers, that had never been human. "He must not complete the ritual." The creatures surged forward but seemed unable to cross the blood circle Elias had drawn. They prowled its perimeter, snarling and snapping, their elongated limbs reaching toward him but falling just short. Eleanor appeared behind them, her form now translucent, fading. "Finish it, Elias," she called. "I cannot hold them much longer." Elias raised the dagger, its silver blade catching the lamplight. The final words of the ritual fell from his lips, words of unmaking, of erasure, of an end that was also a beginning. As he spoke, the room began to shimmer and distort around him, reality itself seeming to bend and warp. The creatures howled in fury and desperation, their forms beginning to dissolve like smoke in a strong wind. Mrs. Winter's body collapsed in on itself, black ichor pouring from her eyes and mouth. The children melted away one by one, their hungry eyes the last part to fade. "Now, Elias," Eleanor cried, her own form barely visible. "Complete the sacrifice." Elias positioned the dagger over his heart, hands steady despite the enormity of what he was about to do. In that moment, a strange peace settled over him. The Dellinger curse would end with him, not through his death, but through his complete unmaking. It was a price he was willing to pay to end the suffering of generations. I, Elias Dellinger, last of my line, give myself willingly to close what was opened, he declared, his voice strong and clear. Let the hunger return to its own realm. Let the door be sealed for all time. Let the Dellinger name be unmade, our sins undone, our suffering erased. With those words, he plunged the dagger into his heart. There was no pain, just as Eleanor had promised, only a spreading warmth and a sensation of falling. The nursery dissolved around him, replaced by swirling darkness shot through with threads of light. Faces flashed before him, his father, stern but sad, his mother, whom he barely remembered, cousins and uncles and ancestors he had never known, but whose blood he shared. And as consciousness faded, Elias Dellinger felt something he had not experienced since childhood: peace. Complete and absolute peace. The Dellinger curse was broken. The hunger was banished. And history itself began to rewrite, erasing the name Dellinger from its pages as if it had never been. Professor James Hargrove adjusted his spectacles as he examined the curious artifact on his desk, a silver dagger with a bone handle, carved with symbols that matched no known historical culture. It had been discovered during the excavation of a previously unknown burial site in rural Pennsylvania, dated approximately to the late 18th century. "Fascinating," he murmured, making another note in his journal. "The metallurgical analysis suggests European origin, yet the symbolism appears to incorporate elements from Eastern European folk magic and Native American iconography, a true anomaly." The small office at Miskatonic University's Department of Anthropology was cluttered with similar oddities, artifacts that defied easy categorization or explanation. James had built his academic reputation on studying such objects, on finding the threads that connected them to known historical contexts. But this dagger was proving particularly challenging. A knock at his office door interrupted his contemplation. "Come in," he called, carefully setting the dagger aside. His research assistant, Sarah Chen, entered with a stack of papers and a concerned expression. "Professor, I found something strange about the Pennsylvania site," she said without preamble. "The property records don't make sense." James raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "According to county records, the land where we found the burial site was purchased in 1787 by a man named Isaiah Dellinger," Sarah explained, spreading several documents on the desk. "He began construction on a large manor house, but apparently died before its completion. The property was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the county for unpaid taxes." "That seems straightforward enough," James noted. "Tragic, but not unusual for the time period." "That's just it," Sarah insisted. I can find no other records of this Isaiah Dellinger. No birth certificate, no marriage license, no death certificate. It's as if he appeared out of nowhere, purchased the land, and then vanished from history. James frowned, intrigued despite himself. Historical gaps were not uncommon, particularly from that era, but complete absence was unusual. What about the burial site itself? Any indication of who might have been interred there? Sarah shook her head. That's another oddity. The grave contained no human remains, just the dagger, placed at the center of what appears to have been a ritual circle. The soil analysis showed traces of human blood, but no body was ever present. A cenotaph, perhaps, James suggested. A memorial grave without a body. Maybe, Sarah conceded, but there's something else. She hesitated, seeming almost embarrassed. The locals have stories about that land. They say it's cursed, that strange things happen there, especially during storms. Children claim to see other children playing among the ruins, though they vanish when approached. And everyone agrees that the area feels wrong somehow, cold even on the hottest days. James smiled indulgently. Local superstitions often attach themselves to archaeological sites, particularly those associated with unexplained deaths or abandoned properties. Folk memories can persist for generations, he said, especially when reinforced by suggestive landscapes or unusual historical circumstances. I know, Sarah agreed, but I visited the site yesterday and... She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. And, James prompted, I heard singing, she admitted quietly. A lullaby, though I couldn't make out the words, and I felt like I was being watched the entire time, not by anything threatening, but by something sad, profoundly sad. James leaned back in his chair, studying his usually pragmatic assistant. Sarah was not given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. If she claimed to have experienced something unusual, it merited consideration. Perhaps we should conduct a more thorough investigation of the site, James suggested, his academic curiosity piqued. The juxtaposition of physical evidence with persistent local folklore often points to historical events that have been obscured or misinterpreted over time. Sarah nodded, visibly relieved that he wasn't dismissing her experience. I've already requested permission for a more extensive excavation. The County Historical Society is surprisingly eager to cooperate. Apparently, they've been trying to understand the site's significance for years. Excellent, James said, returning his attention to the dagger. In the meantime, I'd like to learn more about this Isaiah Dellinger. Even if official records are sparse, there might be mentions in personal correspondence, church registries, or business transactions from the period. I'll see what I can find, Sarah promised, gathering her papers. As she turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind rattled the office window, causing both academics to start. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, unusually dark for early afternoon. Looks like we're in for some weather, James observed. You might want to head home before it hits. Sarah hesitated at the door. Professor, there's one more thing. When I was at the site, I found this. She reached into her pocket and produced a small tarnished locket. It was partially buried near where we found the dagger. James accepted the locket, turning it over in his hands. It was silver, like the dagger, and engraved with the same unusual tree-like symbol. With careful fingers, he pried it open to reveal two miniature portraits, a stern-faced man with deep-set eyes, and a woman with a gentle expression and dark hair piled atop her head. No names, he noted, examining the interior for inscriptions. But the clothing and portraiture style are consistent with the late 18th century. This could indeed be Isaiah Dellinger and his wife. That's what I thought, Sarah agreed. But when I showed it to one of the locals, an elderly woman who lives near the site, she had the strangest reaction. She said they're still waiting for him to come home, and refused to touch it. James frowned, a chill running down his spine despite the office's warmth. Folklore often personifies historical figures, especially those associated with tragic or mysterious circumstances, he said, more to reassure himself than Sarah. It's a way for communities to process and transmit historical memory. Of course, Sarah nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. I'll let you know what I find about Dellinger. After she left, James returned to his examination of the dagger, but found his thoughts continually drawn to the locket. The faces stared up at him with an unsettling intensity, as if trying to communicate across the centuries. Outside, the storm grew closer, thunder rumbling in the distance. 3 days later, James stood in the center of the excavation site, rain dripping from his hat brim, despite the protective tarp overhead. The storm that had threatened on the day of his conversation with Sarah had never fully materialized, instead lingering over the region like a brooding presence, occasionally releasing short, violent downpours before subsiding into ominous silence. The expanded excavation had revealed the foundations of what had indeed been a substantial manor house, though only the east wing's foundation remained relatively intact. At its center was a room that, based on its dimensions and location, appeared to have been a nursery, an odd feature for a house built by a man who, according to Sarah's research, had died childless. Professor Hargrove called one of the graduate students assisting with the dig. "You need to see this." James made his way carefully across the muddy site to where the student knelt beside a section of exposed flooring in the nursery foundation. Unlike the stone used for the structural elements, this was wood, remarkably well preserved given its age, as if protected from the elements by some unknown means. "We found it under a layer of more recent flooring," the student explained. "It appears to be original to the structure." James crouched for a closer look, immediately understanding the student's excitement. The wooden floor was marked with a large circle, still faintly visible after more than 2 centuries. Within the circle were symbols, matching those on the dagger and locket, the strange tree-like pattern and other markings that defied easy categorization. "It appears to be some kind of ritual space," James murmured, tracing one of the symbols with a gloved finger. "Consistent with certain folk magic practices of the period, though the specific symbolism is unusual." "That's not all," the student said, pointing to the center of the circle. "Look at this." In the exact center of the circle was a dark stain, a deep red-brown that had penetrated the wood so thoroughly that it remained visible despite the passage of time. James didn't need laboratory analysis to recognize it as blood. "Take samples," he instructed, "and photograph everything before we proceed. This could be significant." As the student moved to comply, Sarah approached, holding a folder and wearing an expression that suggested important news. "I found him," she said without preamble. "Isaiah Dellinger, or rather, I found where he came from." James straightened, his interest piqued. "Go on." "He was born in London in 1750, the son of a moderately successful merchant," Sarah explained, opening the folder to reveal copies of various documents. "He came to America in 1775, apparently to establish a trading outpost for his father's company. What's interesting is that he seems to have disappeared for nearly a decade. From 1778 to 1787, there's no record of his whereabouts or activities." "The Revolutionary War would have disrupted many records," James noted. "True, but this is different," Sarah insisted. "It's as if he deliberately dropped out of sight. When he reappears in 1787, he purchases this land and begins construction on the manor. He also marries a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of a Philadelphia physician." "The woman from the locket," James surmised. "Most likely," Sarah agreed. "Here's where it gets strange. According to a letter I found in the Blackwood family archives, Isaiah and Eleanor were desperate to have children. Eleanor's father mentions consulting with specialists and trying various treatments, all without success. Not unusual for the time," James observed. "Infertility was poorly understood, and effective treatments were virtually non-existent. "Yes, but listen to this," Sarah said, extracting a fragile yellowed letter from the folder. "This is from Eleanor to her sister, dated March 1788. Isaiah has returned from his journey with renewed hope. He speaks of a solution he has discovered, one that defies conventional understanding, but which he swears will grant us the child we so desperately desire. I confess I am frightened by the change in him. There is a fervor in his eyes that borders on madness, and he spends hours locked in his study with a book he will not allow me to see. He has begun construction on a nursery in the East Wing, though there is no child to occupy it. When I expressed concern, he assured me that by winter we would have our son. The certainty with which he speaks chills me to the bone." James frowned, a sense of unease settling over him. "And what happened? Did they have a child?" Sarah shook her head. "That's the last letter from Eleanor in the family archives. According to county death records, Isaiah Dellinger died in November 1788, less than a year after purchasing the property. The cause of death is listed simply as misadventure. There's no record of Eleanor's fate, nor any indication that they ever had a child." Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and the rain intensified, drumming against the protective tarp. From the woods surrounding the excavation site came a sound that might have been the wind through the trees, or might have been singing, a soft lullaby just at the edge of hearing. "Professor," called another student, this one working near what would have been the manor's entrance, "we've found something else." James and Sarah made their way to the new discovery, a large stone that appeared to have been part of the manor's foundation, now unearthed and cleaned of centuries of dirt. Carved into its surface was an inscription, Isaiah Dellinger, 1750-1788. What price legacy? Below this formal epitaph, carved in a different, less practiced hand, were additional words, and his wife, Eleanor, and their son, Thomas. "And all who came after May, they find in death the peace denied them in life." "But you said they never had a child," James said, turning to Sarah with a puzzled frown. "According to all official records, they didn't," she confirmed. "There's no birth certificate, no baptismal record, nothing to suggest the existence of a Thomas Dellinger." "Yet someone believed he existed," James mused, studying the inscription. "Someone who felt he deserved commemoration alongside his parents." The wind picked up suddenly, whipping the tarp and sending a shower of raindrops onto the exposed stone. One of the graduate students gasped, pointing at the ground near the foundation stone. "Look!" she exclaimed. "Footprints!" Sure enough, a set of small footprints had appeared in the mud, child-sized impressions that led from the stone toward the nursery foundation. But what caused James's breath to catch was the impossibility of their appearance. The ground had been covered with a tarp, the rain had not touched it, and no child had been present at the excavation site. Yet there they were, perfect footprints appearing one after another as if an invisible child were walking slowly, deliberately toward the nursery. "Everyone back to the vehicles," James ordered, his academic skepticism warring with a primal instinct for self-preservation. "We're suspending work until the weather improves." No one argued. The team quickly gathered their equipment and hurried toward the line of cars and vans parked at the edge of the property. James lingered, watching in horrified fascination as the footprints continued to form, now circling the ritual area in the nursery foundation. "Professor, come on!" Sarah called from beneath an umbrella, her voice nearly lost in a crash of thunder. James turned to join her, but as he did, he caught movement from the corner of his eye, a small figure standing at the edge of the woods, partially obscured by rain and mist. A child, dressed in clothing from another century, watching the excavation site with solemn intensity. "Hello?" James called, taking a step toward the figure. "Are you lost?" The child remained motionless, and as James drew closer, he realized with a jolt that he could see through the small figure to the trees beyond. The child's features were indistinct except for the eyes, deep-set and sorrowful, holding a knowledge no child should possess. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. The spectral child tilted its head, regarding him with those ancient eyes. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am what remains when everything else is taken. I am the echo of what never was." Lightning split the sky, momentarily blinding James. When his vision cleared, the child was gone, leaving no trace of its presence. "Professor!" Sarah was beside him now, tugging at his arm. "We need to go. Now!" James allowed himself to be led back to the vehicles, his mind struggling to rationalize what he had seen. Hallucination brought on by stress and suggestion, perhaps, or a trick of the light and weather, combined with his immersion in the site's mysterious history. Yet as they drove away, he couldn't shake the child's words from his mind. "I am the echo of what never was." That night, in his campus apartment, James dreamed of the Dellinger property. In his dream, the manor stood intact, a grand structure of dark stone and wood, its windows glowing with warm light despite the storm that raged around it. The east wing rose slightly higher than the rest, its architecture subtly different, more ornate. James found himself approaching the front door, which swung open at his touch. Inside, the entrance hall was dominated by a large portrait of a stern-faced man, Isaiah Dellinger, recognizable from the locket miniature, but somehow more imposing, more alive. "We've been expecting you, Professor," said a voice from the shadows. A woman emerged, Eleanor Dellinger, her dark hair piled atop her head, just as in the locket portrait. She wore a burgundy dress with a high collar, her expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. "This is a dream," James stated, though he felt none of the usual disconnection of dreaming. Everything was vivid, tactile, present. "Yes and no," Eleanor replied. "Dreams are doorways, Professor Hargrove. Sometimes they allow us to reach across boundaries that are otherwise impermeable." "Boundaries of what? Time? Reality? Existence itself," she said simply. "Come, there's something you need to see." She led him through the manor, up a grand staircase, and down a long corridor lined with portraits, all children, all with the same deep-set eyes and solemn expressions. At the end of the corridor stood a white door with gold trim, adorned with the now familiar tree-like symbol. The nursery, James realized. Eleanor nodded, where it began and where it ended. The door opened to reveal the room James had seen in ruins at the excavation site, now whole and furnished as it would have been in the late 18th century. A cradle stood in the center, draped with fine lace. Above it hung a mobile of carved wooden children, slowly rotating though there was no breeze. But it was the far wall that drew James's attention, covered floor to ceiling with names and dates, hundreds of them, all written in what appeared to be blood, all Dellinger names, all children, none having lived past their 12th year, and at the very bottom one final entry, Elias Dellinger, 1850-1880. "I don't understand," James said, turning to Eleanor. "Who are all these children? The historical record shows Isaiah died childless." "History was rewritten," Eleanor replied, moving to stand beside the cradle, "or rather, unmade. What you see here is the echo of a bloodline that no longer exists, that never existed, thanks to Elias's sacrifice." "Elias? The last name on the wall?" Eleanor nodded. "The last of the Dellinger line. He gave himself not just to death, but to complete erasure from history, to close the door Isaiah had opened and banish the hunger back to its own realm." "What hunger?" James asked, a chill running down his spine despite the room's warmth. "What door?" Instead of answering directly, Eleanor gestured to a book lying on a nearby table, a leather-bound volume with the tree symbol embossed on its cover. "Isaiah found this during his missing years, the decade your assistant could find no record of. He was searching for a way to ensure his legacy, to guarantee an heir despite our inability to conceive. The book contained a ritual, a bargain. A bargain with what? Something ancient, something that feeds on potential, on futures unlived and dreams unrealized. Isaiah offered it tribute, one child from each generation of Dellingers, in exchange for fertility and an unbroken lineage. James frowned, trying to make sense of this impossible narrative. But you said the Dellingers were erased from history, that they never existed. That was Elias's sacrifice, Eleanor explained. He discovered what his ancestor had done, understood the price that generations of Dellinger children had paid, and he found a way to undo it all, to close the door and banish the hunger by offering himself completely, not just his life, but his very existence. She moved to the wall of names, touching the final entry with gentle fingers. The ritual worked. History rewrote itself as if the Dellingers had never been. Isaiah died in 1788 before any child was conceived. The manor was never completed. The hunger was banished back to its own realm. Then how are we having this conversation? James asked. How can you exist to tell me this story if you were erased from history? Eleanor smiled sadly. I told you, Professor, dreams are doorways, and some echoes persist despite everything. The site remembers what happened there, even if history does not. The land remembers the blood that soaked it, the pain that permeated it, the sacrifice that cleansed it. Outside the nursery window, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating a figure standing in the garden below. A man in his 30s with prematurely graying hair and a thin scar running from his right temple to his jawline. He looked up at the window, his eyes meeting James's across the impossible gulf between them. Elias, James whispered, somehow knowing it was him. Eleanor nodded. He lingers closest of all. His sacrifice was the greatest and the most recent. The hunger is gone, banished back to its realm, but the echoes remain. We remain. Why show me this? James asked, turning back to her. Why reach across time or whatever this is, to tell me a story that never happened? Because you found the dagger, Eleanor said simply, the silver blade that Elias used to complete his sacrifice. It exists outside the rewritten history because it was the instrument of that rewriting. And now that you've brought it back to the site, the echoes are growing stronger. She moved to the nursery door, her form becoming increasingly translucent. You must return the dagger to the circle, Professor. Bury it where it was meant to rest. Only then will the echoes fade, and the last remnants of the Dellinger tragedy be allowed to dissipate. And if I don't? James asked, though he already suspected the answer. Then the door may begin to open again, Eleanor warned, her voice fading along with her form. Not wide enough for the hunger to return. Elias's sacrifice ensured that, but enough for the echoes to grow stronger, to take more substantial form. Enough for the pain to continue, endlessly repeating like a record stuck in its groove. She was nearly gone now, her voice barely audible. Free us, Professor. Let us fade completely. It's the kindness we've waited for all these years. James woke with a start, his heart racing, the dream still vivid in his mind. Rain lashed against his apartment windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, the same storm that had been lingering for days, neither advancing nor dissipating. On his bedside table lay the silver dagger, though he was certain he had left it locked in his office. Beside it was the locket, open to reveal the miniature portraits of Isaiah and Eleanor Dellinger, a couple who, according to history, had no children and left no legacy. But as James stared at the portraits, he noticed something he had missed before. Reflected in the glass covering Isaiah's stern features was another face, a child's face with deep-set eyes and a solemn expression. And in Eleanor's portrait, a similar reflection showed a young man with prematurely graying hair and a thin scar running from his right temple to his jawline, echoes of what never was. The next morning, James returned alone to the Dellinger property. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a landscape washed clean, the ruins of the manor foundation glistening in the early sunlight. The excavation equipment stood abandoned, the team having agreed to a day's break after the strange events of the previous afternoon. James made his way directly to the nursery foundation, the silver dagger heavy in his pocket. The ritual circle was still visible in the preserved wood, the symbols clear in the morning light. At its center, the bloodstain remained, the physical evidence of a sacrifice that, if his dream was to be believed, had unmade an entire family line. Kneeling at the edge of the circle, James removed the dagger and the locket. After a moment's hesitation, he placed both at the center, directly over the bloodstain. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but compelled to speak nonetheless. "I don't know if any of what I experienced was real or just an elaborate construction of my subconscious. But if you're there, Elias, Eleanor, all of you, I'm doing as you asked. I'm returning what was found, letting the echoes fade." As he spoke, a breeze stirred across the excavation site, unusual given the stillness of the morning. It carried with it the faint sound of a music box playing a lullaby. And for a moment, James thought he saw them. Translucent figures standing among the ruins, a woman in a burgundy dress, a stern-faced man, and dozens of children of various ages, all with the same deep-set eyes and solemn expressions. At their center stood a man in his 30s, with prematurely graying hair and a thin scar on his face, his expression one of profound peace. The figures raised their hands in a gesture that might have been farewell or gratitude. Then, like mist under a strengthening sun, they began to fade, growing fainter until they disappeared completely. The music box melody faded with them, leaving only the natural sounds of the morning. Birdsong, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of a stream. James remained kneeling for several minutes, absorbing what he had witnessed. When he finally looked down at the center of the circle, the dagger and locket were gone. Not removed or stolen, but simply gone, as if they had never been there at all. In their place was a single white flower, a type James didn't recognize, with petals that seemed to shimmer slightly in the sunlight. As he watched, the flower slowly withered and dissolved into dust, which the breeze carried away across the ruins of what had once been Dellinger Manor. The echoes had faded. The story that never happened had finally found its ending. And as James rose to his feet, he felt a profound sense of completion, as if he had been part of something much larger than himself, something that spanned centuries and transcended the boundaries of conventional reality. He would continue the excavation, document the site, publish his findings, but he knew that the most significant aspect of the Dellinger property would remain forever undocumented, the echo of a bloodline that had sacrificed everything to undo a terrible mistake, to close a door that should never have been opened. As he walked back to his car, James glanced one last time at the ruins of the East Wing. For an instant, he thought he saw a child standing among the foundations, a small boy with deep-set eyes and a solemn expression. The child raised his hand in farewell, then turned and walked away, fading into the morning mist until he was gone completely. Not gone, James corrected himself, never there to begin with, an echo of what never was.